I was employee number 30 at Facebook, then I got fired. 10 non-obvious lessons I learned from working directly under Mark Zuckerberg. Have a big-ass vision. We were all in our 20s when Mark was offered $1 billion to sell Facebook. When he said no, he sent a message to all of us around the world. That inspired the shit out of us.
What I do love is the mission that I'm contributing to.
Number 2. Number 3. Number 4.
I don't think I agree with hire fast, actually. I think hire slow, fire fast is a better way of doing it.
Number 5.
Sometimes you have to let people fail.
Number 6. Number 7.
You're only as good as your worst piece of work.
Number 8 here, it says only hire A players.
I think Mark pulls it out well. It's somebody I would go into business with.
Number 9.
It's speed, but also take risks.
Number 10 is... In this week's Memes and Machines, South by Southwest is coming to London. What do we think? We talk about Apple. Are they having an identity crisis? Why do we not like their latest ads? Conversely, Airbnb. They just can't miss right now. What lessons can be learnt from Airbnb? And we dive into 10 lessons from Mark Zuckerberg. They're not fashion lessons. They're business fundamentals from someone that worked with him very closely right at the start of Facebook, and I think there are tremendous things to be learnt from startups, business professionals, tech enthusiasts and marketeers.
Find out why joining a startup is the worst decision you will ever make.
Oh, saucy. I like it. I like it. Catman, it's good to see you as always. What's going off?
Good to see you, man. Good to see you. Not much. It's been a busy week and a quiet week at the same time. The Met Gala, one of the biggest events, was this week, which is always something I get my teeth sunk into. I don't know if you tried to replicate any of the looks.
I did cover myself in sand and some super glue. And did not quite wear it as well, but here you go.
Right.
It's good. I imagine it's an absolute field day for your meme page.
It is a little bit, yeah.
Yeah, good man. On that, I actually saw I think there's just been this real resurgence of, I must have seen at least 15 different brands meme the Met Gala images. Some of the most iconic moments, and every single one I saw just absolutely banged. Was probably the top performing piece of content. And then you will see lots of ad professionals saying, is this what we've come to? They're always frustrated. They will say this is not creativity. This is not originality. This is who is the fastest to react to a moment that is happening in the world. And I always just think, get over yourself. Our job is to be effective. That's the number one rule, be effective. And for some people, it's just going to be doing a meme, right?
And do you know what the funny thing is? If you ever ask someone to sit down and make a meme, it always looks a lot easier than people think. But actually just, getting the caption right, being funny off the cuff is actually quite difficult. And there's a reason they perform so well. Like, it's probably the lowest effort, highest reward piece of marketing you can do. But I still think there's a very small percentage of people who can make them and can actually operate that quickly and know how to pick out the right moment. And so, I think it's one of those things that, funnily enough, I feel like it's the one marketing tactic we were doing maybe 5-10 years ago and still is prevalent today, which tells me it's probably going to be something we're going to live with for the rest of our lives now.
Well, it is the language of the internet, and it's very interesting because you're right, there's such a subtlety to the art. It's what comedians do so well. They're really observational. They can just describe a very mundane interaction in all our lives, but they just capture it so perfectly that it just makes you laugh and feel joy. And that's fundamentally what memes do. That's what they are. And it's something we've talked about together a lot around, what characteristics do great social media managers have? Sure, they're good copywriters. Sure, they're pretty creative, organized, but I think fundamentally one of the skills that the really top tier, they're quite funny, right? They have this just wit, and they speak the internet really well. For anyone that doesn't know, that I suppose that's kind of your soiree into marketing was just born out of, what was your first page was it Medieval Reacts?
My first page was exam problems, which was a page around GCSE exams in the UK. And so I used to get home from an exam and everyone was doing the same exams the same day in the country. So I'd make memes about the questions on those exams. So it was this hyper relevant, super funny, and it wasn't, there was no back then I didn't know what the word social media manager meant. I didn't know really what marketing was. I just wanted to be funny. And I made this dumb page that overnight got 15, 20,000 followers. And I think has shaped my marketing ever since. It's kind of been the foundation of my understanding of how the internet works. And actually, I think all of my knowledge in content creation can be traced back to that.
Yeah. Well, you've been a practitioner. You've played not intentionally, but you were playing the attention games. A long, long time ago, right? A decade ago, you were playing the attention games, and I think it's something that I think as you've progressed in your career and taken on more senior roles and your responsibilities have shifted. One thing I've always admired about you is continuing to be a practitioner. I remember when you first started Pathetic Fashion, and you're like, I need to do this to stay sharp. I'm spending too much time doing these things for brands, and I'm sure it's your own creative outlet, something you find innately fulfilling. You're not doing it with that much intention per se, but just that practitioner knowledge and that willingness. And I've seen it. I saw one of my friends as an agency. They're a specialist in mobile apps, and he's been a social media marketeer, particularly for applications, for a long time, going on nearly a decade. And in the last maybe 9 months, he's really started to take off as a content creator himself and documenting not work, but his passion projects. And he does it and he said, I have actually learned more in 9 months of focusing my energy as a content creator than I have in a decade of being a social media marketeer. And there's so much truth in that. Just 9 months, he's just said. And so few people, particularly who are senior in the industry, either choose to do that or have that skill.
Yeah, I spending a lot of time recently with George McGill, who we work with at Social Chain. He obviously has his own agency as well. And recently started a page called The Ad Professor, where they've been making ads for brands that they don't actually work with yet. But, he said to me the same thing, where it's if an agency can't market themselves, then how can you trust them to market you? And they've now built this huge audience, which is basically a combination of they share their favorite ads throughout the internet, which is curation, that's audience building, but then every other post is an ad they've made themselves, right? Which is, it could be about Coca-Cola, it could be about Airbnb. They don't necessarily work with these brands, but they're saying, if I did, this is what I'd make. And they're top notch, they're incredible, right? And so what they've done is they've now created a reputation before they've actually worked with these clients. And he said this is their funnel now for new business is incredible. It just rolls it in a way that it wouldn't have before. And it's a strategy that I think a lot of agencies, once they get to a certain size, they think, I don't need to put my work out there, people come to us. But actually, creating that constant funnel of new business is invaluable.
Yeah, George is a phenomenal talent and writer. It's funny, I had this conversation. I shared one of the pieces of work internally in some of our comms, and the response is, phenomenal, pure admiration. And I think what's really smart about what they've done as in marketing themselves is it's through the lens of this objective media entity, the Ad Professor. So, they spend a lot of time building trust, just celebrating great work, but I think they put some really smart commentary. It's always kind of distilling it down in a sentence in why it's great and what made it great, or those two sentences. and just really highlighting the genius as opposed to just sharing something that they admire or see. And then that layering of every week introducing the ad of the week. And I think they do brilliantly, even if they don't work with any of those brands, I think George does a phenomenal job of picking brands that people have a connection with and an understanding. Like it kind of connects. If you're an unknown entity and you don't have, I don't know anything about you, the ad has to be like so irreverent, but it has to do something or a great story. If you think of like these types of ads that are like graphics and really smart copy, it only works if I understand what I'm seeing in many respects. And I think it does a phenomenal job of like picking those brands that we have an affinity to, we have an understanding of what they stand for. I think the one I really enjoyed was the Nutella one. It might have been like last week or the week before. And it's like, this is something, this is breakfast. And I just thought those formulas are phenomenal. But yeah, incredibly smart. I don't know too much about the broader team, but I'm a big fan of George's writing, so I imagine it's permeated that company and they're probably a great outfit.
Yeah, and I think the final thing to say there is that in marketing right now, I feel like the differentiator for agencies is creative, right? Like paid marketing, all these kind of tactics, they're becoming, I think, almost standardized in a way, right? Like there's probably a base level. You're competing for these like marginal percentage gains. But if you can show you're the best creative agency, I think that's how you get picked. And so that's what they're really focusing on is, not, I don't know, they do this as well, but it's not saying, we can get a 10x return on ad spend. It's saying we can make your ad look like this great, or we can come up with copy this clever, because that's actually what people are looking for now. That's the differentiator.
And I think the wonderful thing about that overall strategy, just from a business development standpoint, is 95% of B2B buyers are never in market or not in market at the time. So there's this thing that no one has control over, timing. So by you curating and being a regular staple of seasoned marketeers of all seniority, you just never know when you hit that inbox at the perfect time. And that cadence is really important. So yeah, I think for a number of reasons, it's a phenomenally smart strategy. I'd imagine we're probably going to see more and more companies try something similar, with their own sort of lead magnet, but it only ever works if you're providing value. And that's what I think George has done phenomenally well, just giving out value. And it speaks to his talents as a creative, right? Dude, did you see that South by Southwest is coming to London?
I did not.
Did not. What? Well, now I'm breaking this news to you. How do you feel about that? South by Southwest, music, barbecue food, hipsters, conferences, ideas.
I think I've always been a bit confused as to what South by Southwest really was. I've never been. It's the first thing I'll say. And my introduction to it was through the advertising world. So I was always under the impression that it was kind of like an advertising conference. And then I hear it's actually a music festival. It's actually a conference festival. It feels like the kind of brand activation capital, of the world. That's mainly what I've seen it as is brands kind of showing up and I guess attaching themselves to culture and creativity in some way. So I guess it makes sense that they're expanding outside of the US.
Yeah, they do an event in Australia that's quite seasoned, and this is their first soiree into Europe. I've been a few times now. I've been fortunate to speak there once. First time I went, I remember Steve was speaking, and my mind got blown, not for the actual event itself, but it was the first time, electric scooters. Austin was the first place where I ever got on just an electric scooter where you got on your app and paid however many dollars and just rode. And I remember that day, there were so many things we could have done. And I think we just spent a hell of a lot of time just going around on these scooters. But yeah, I think South by Southwest is probably, I've been to the Web Summit, I've been to probably most of the flagships. And if I think of that spectrum of like Adland completely, indulging itself, on one end you've got Cannes, I think in the middle, which just feel like there's more value exchange. You've got South by Southwest, which, yes, you're going to show off your big brand activation, etc. But I see a lot of value, and I've experienced it's kind of a special place. My big question would be, I don't know what type of venue you would host this in. It's got to have charm and character, and it like needs a lot of real estate and a lot of spaces to host all the side events and all the big activations. So it can't be like the London Excel or even the O2. They're going to have to pick some obscure part of London, I think. But I suppose they already have that in mind. I think it's good for the creative arts industry. I think it's good for the UK. So yeah, let's see what happens. Watch this space. I'm sure they'll reveal a lot more in coming weeks, and we will see many brand activations as a consequence. Dude, I did want to raise two ads with you that I've seen recently. Both, you could argue, iconic tech businesses in their own right. And I think it speaks to one that feels a little lost in their marketing efforts, if I'm being very honest. And this is a brand I deeply love and admire. Feels they're losing a bit of their sparkle. And another brand that I've always admired for their subtlety, for their purpose-driven. I really, respect the leadership there. I want to start with the one that I think is going through a bit of an identity crisis, and that sadly is Apple. Did you see the ads this week for the iPad launch?
I did, yes.
Tell us what happened. What did you think?
I think when I first saw it, for those of you who haven't seen it, it's to advertise the new iPad. And this iPad is the thinnest iPad yet. And that's kind of the key value prop that they're pushing forward, which I think is, questionable in itself. That are we past the point of caring about how thin our devices are? But we can put that to one side for now. But the ad basically depicts a huge hydraulic press pressing down on a large number of creative tools and instruments. So keyboards, trumpets, old computers, anything that a creative might use to make art, essentially. And it crushes these things down in this kind of very visually, kind of almost pleasing way. It's this kind of one of these brain scratchers. You kind of can't keep your eye, you can't stop watching it. Seeing these things be destructed, and then it pulls up and the iPad is below to kind of illustrate the iPad is so thin it can fit under this hydraulic press, but also to illustrate that all these instruments are packed into this one device, which is obviously the insight, the value prop they're trying to push. I think there's a few things, because when I saw it, I immediately could imagine the creative proposal, and it was a great one, right? It was a great idea, and the idea is that we're going to crush all these items, and that's going to make people think that you can fit them all into an iPad. Hydraulic presses are trending right now. There's content, right, where people just crush things, and that's an interesting insight that they probably pulled on. All these levers felt right. It was inherently social first. It was very kind of abrasive, and it was attention capturing. So they kind of ticked all the boxes, but something felt very, very off with the execution of it all, which is that it ultimately came across as very sort of dystopian and negative. And come across, it's almost very difficult to watch these, beautifully crafted items, which probably took somebody a long time to make, right? So there's like an old vintage trumpet is the first thing that gets crushed. And you kind of think, well, somebody spent a long time making this and you're destroying it for the sake of an advert. It actually felt anti-Apple in many ways. And I think they were trying to go back to their roots of being quite divisive and striking with their marketing. You think back to the 1984 ads, but it just missed the mark, and it didn't feel like a love letter to the creative arts, which I think is what they intended. It felt like the antithesis of that. And so a lot of people said, actually, they captured our attention and everyone's talking about it, so they won. But I don't think Apple are at that stage where that's their main goal, is to make people talk about them. Everybody's already talking. They already have our attention. their goal is much bigger than that. Their goal is to win the hearts and minds of creatives, and this simply didn't do that. So, breaking news while we've been recording this ad is that they have since apologized and are pulling the ad from all.
Apologized. Wow, we have an apology from the horse's mouth. I think you touch on some really important topics, and I am going to describe this as a sentiment crime. It was Apple being maybe not self-aware enough, and I'll explain that point. And firstly, I want to say I fundamentally agree with you about them ticking all the boxes. It was probably rooted in some great insights. It should have worked on every sense. But the reason I say it's a sentiment crime is Apple aren't that business. They are not that brand. They embody, I would say, the more ethical end of the tech ecosystem in terms of their reputation. I'm sure there are things that they could do better and have more of a positive impact in the world, all the things around how they treat employees in China, in the Foxconn factory, and all of these things. Look, there are ethical challenges with any business of that size, but fundamentally, it for me is a sentiment crime, is because crushing all these nostalgic items in a way, to your point, that was dystopian and a bit crude. You go, big tech should not be doing that. Yeah. Like, that's kind of what they've done, metaphorically in the world, you could argue. Sure. Destroyed businesses, industry, the human elements of life. So there was just something so wrong, despite it ticking every box. So yeah, I think they committed a sentiment crime, and I don't think they need to play those games anymore. My favorite works aren't when in 1984 they were a startup. They were on the front end of an emerging IT revolution and hardware revolution. Today, do they need that? Probably not. They don't need to do that. And like, if I think of maybe the last couple of years, they really do seem to have lost their creative voice. Ever since Shot on iPhone, I thought Shot on iPhone was a beautiful execution that they continue to use and was mastery. I remember us having a debate just maybe a year ago or 6 months ago around the kind of ESG claims they were making, the sustainable claims, and they sat around the boardroom with the executives, and some people loved it. I don't think you were a big fan. You thought it was a bit corny and naff. And then they've gone, in a different direction this time, but are missing the mark again. What do brands that we love, what do they do when they start to probably have more misses than hits? What's your advice?
Yeah, I think the final thing I'll say is that the reveal didn't feel proportional to the...
that's a good point. Yeah, that's a good point.
So like, this big crazy thing happens, and what is the outcome? We're 2 millimeters thinner than we used to be. And that's not the reason people aren't buying iPads, right? I think that's the big problem that they felt with that. It just didn't feel like they were necessarily addressing, I think, what the gap they were trying to fill there, which is clearly people aren't buying iPads at the rate that they prefer, and it's not become this kind of creative tool that they envisaged. And it probably is the same with the ad you just mentioned with Mother Nature, where it felt like this big production. It was creatively very rich. It got me watching. It got me glued. And then the outcome was, we're going to become carbon neutral. We're going to do all these kind of, fluffy eco, outcomes, which I don't really fully grasp as a consumer. And so I think constantly we're not seeing the innovation at the same pace as we're seeing these kind of creative efforts.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. I will say, conversely, there's a brand that I have long admired for a number of reasons, and I think it's worth giving them their props, is AirBNB. I don't know if you saw recently their recreation of Up as an activation. They created the iconic house. They did the balloons. The house rose. and it happened to be on a crane. They zoom out. And if you think of the context of the world right now, where we're seeing CGI, big visual spectacle happen time and time and time again. And it's actually interesting because I thought they would be these kind of CGI activations. They're still hitting when someone comes with a good concept. They're still getting the appreciation. I thought it was kind of novel, one and done. But it seems that they're maybe becoming a staple of the content calendar in some respects, and they're still being admired because they're using iconic landmarks and they're using this surrealism, and it's a new style that people kind of like. So I think that's interesting. And then you see Airbnb go all in and do it in real life. I thought it was a wonderful execution, but I think it speaks to a broader point. Everything they do time and time again, their collaboration with Barbie was phenomenal. I think they won the activation space when they recreated the Barbie home, and there was so many good activations. And I know there's plenty of naff ones, but there was some really good collaborations there. Airbnb seemed to win, and it speaks to a bit of a cultural shift. And we've had this conversation before around Brian Chesky coming out and feeling that the organization had lost its purpose in some respects. And he's made some radical changes operationally, and how he's, I suppose, flattened the organizations and tried to transform it back into a startup. They made some very radical moves where they deployed or reduced significant amounts of performance budget, where they were attributing spend and put that into comms and put that into creativity, and really invested in brand and all these collaborations, etc. So they made some big bets, and I think I think it's really paying off. Certainly, I'm an admirer of their work at the very least. What are your thoughts on Airbnb when you contrast that, I suppose, with a company like Apple that have long been at the top of the mountain, but seem to, maybe get it wrong today?
Yeah. Similarly, I've been a big admirer of Airbnb's last 12 months or so, both from a marketing perspective and from a product perspective. And that also comes from a place of someone who has become disillusioned with Airbnb as a product. I've started booking hotels probably just as much as I book Airbnbs, because usually the price is now roughly similar, and the experience you're getting at a lot of Airbnbs is, objectively worse. And so what I think has been really interesting is they have this really now close alignment between product and marketing. I think the Icons campaign you just talked about is a really great example, where they had this incredible creative campaign where you can book the house and up, you can book all these incredible, fantastical experiences. It's so closely tied to the experience of Airbnb. It's all hosted on their site. You experience the campaign through Airbnb.com. It almost kind of inspires you to then go look at other places you will actually book. They do this really good job of getting your hands on the product whenever they do their marketing. And you can tell all of their campaigns are coming from a place of product marketing. And what they've also done, I think, really nicely is simplify a lot of their marketing. And, there's been Brian Chesky did a really good podcast where he talked about the tactical changes he's made at a kind of organization level. So he's removed the product function. He's kind of made the engineers responsible for shipping, and every single marketer is a product marketer. And you see that in the way they ship now, that you feel like features are coming at a faster rate than any other tech company. And one thing I've learned from being in a tech company is that as you scale, you become much slower. You ship products slower. The first year that you launch, that's actually the fastest you ever really move. And then everything after that becomes more slow, more cumbersome. There are more layers of approval. Things just slow down significantly. And Airbnb have done a good job of getting back to that kind of startup level of pace. And that's really been driven by a CEO obsessed with the mission, which I think is really important. But also he's done something that we've talked about a few times, which is understood the importance of the founder being a voice for the company. And any single product that ships now, it comes through his voice. It comes through his Twitter account. He talks about it, right? It's a very simple product animation showing how the product works, but it comes from him. And it actually gets way more engagement than it would if it came from their personal account. So it really feels like it's one man on a mission to drive this company forward. And I think a lot of the really successful tech companies, Facebook's another great example, Meta, it feels like a one-man mission at times. Like this person has this dogged belief in his company and he's driving it forward. And they understand that from a consumer perspective, you buy into that mission more than you do a competitor, which is kind of faceless and you don't really know where it's coming from. One final thing I'll say on Airbnb, I know I've been speaking for a while, but they did another campaign which I really loved, which was focused heavily on education. And I talk about like education a lot as like that should be the foundation of a lot of marketing efforts. But they did a huge media campaign, and I walk past the billboard every single day in New York, which talks about why you book an Airbnb over a hotel. So they specifically have honed in on this insight that people are returning back to hotels. And I saw this billboard, and I couldn't remember what the creative was, but the message was essentially, where do your friends hang out when you book hotel rooms? Right? There's no like central kind of living room or shared space that you can hang out and talk and have dinner. And it kind of hit me. I was like, oh yeah, I forgot that's why actually Airbnbs are so interesting, is that you have this shared space. There was another one that was, in a hotel room, your kid's bedtime is your bedtime now. And again, it's this like thing that clicked where I'm like, oh yeah, that's also why I guess Airbnbs make sense for families, is that you have these separate rooms and you can go and have separate lives. So it was almost an opportunity for Airbnb to remind people why they were booking themselves in the first place. And, maybe it's kind of obscuring the fact that the prices have increased and that's actually not really a compelling reason anymore. But they're doing a good job of reminding people why it was compelling in the first place. Yeah, just in general, I think all of that together has made them have this really kind of good run for the last 12 months.
I think beautiful summary. And I would add to that, I think everything ladders down from the humility of the founder coming out and saying, you know what, we lost our way. And you're seeing that permeate in marketing, that what you're describing there of addressing that challenge. Maybe the economics of the business mean it's never going to compete on price anymore. It might not compete on price, and it once did. So that could be front and center. 98% of the experiences on there and the listings are not the romantic, really special places that are very unique. A lot of people now don't use it, the kind of nomadic sort of adventurers that once wanted to like drop themselves and immerse themselves in a culture. That exists, but that's such a small part of their audience profile now. And actually, just by pulling out those moments, those human elements that you're describing, and the disadvantages of what can feel, most hotels are kind of generic. Yes, there are boutique experiences, but it's kind of much of the same. The fact that they're doing that, again, speaks to this like company humility and self-awareness that is really refreshing. And I think they're very tasteful in their execution. I think they have a prestigiousness about how they show up in the world, their attention to detail. And actually, as you were describing things you admired and your observations of the company, it drew me into a tweet that I read. It was about a guy that had worked for Mark Zuckerberg. And I want to read it because I think it kind of speaks a lot to these different factors and phases companies go through. And the real outlier companies tend to share many of these characteristics. So I'm just going to read them to you because I think it's a good basis. So the headline of the tweet was, I was employee number 30 at Facebook, then I got fired. Now I'm the CEO of a 100 million company. Bit clickbaity. Didn't like that line, but I did like the follow-up. It said 10 non-obvious lessons I learned from working directly under Mark Zuckerberg. Being honest, you could have just said that, right? that would have done the same effect, but there's a subtle brag in there. So let me read the 10 because I actually really like these, and many of them I've come to learn and have an appreciation for as I'm on an entrepreneurial journey. Number 10 is focus on one goal. Mark's goal was 1 billion users. Every idea that was brought to him, he'd ask, does this help us grow or not? If it wasn't driving towards that goal, we didn't do it. You don't go fast by doing many things, but by doing one thing extremely well. Give me your perspective on focus and that, that singular goal, and how do you think about that in terms of marketing objectives?
Yeah, it's great, and I think it's especially when you're like year 1 or 2, it's probably the most important thing is focus, because you learn pretty quickly there's like a million things you can do, right? There's like a million directions you can go in, and that focus helps you it helps you make decisions. It helps you choose between doing this thing or doing the other thing. Like, what is this actually going to strive towards that goal? What I think it's actually most helpful for is, like, obviously you have this like wider high level company goal. Like, this is what we're going to be, this is our 10-year mission. But actually what it really helps you do is decide what you're doing every Monday. Like, every single week, right? We have this kind of framework, it's called the A+ goal. And so like every single Monday, each person has, what is the one goal this week? If I completed would be a fuck yeah goal. Because it's actually really difficult in a startup where you have no structure, you have no history, so you have no pattern recognition. You actually don't know a lot of the times when you wake up in the morning, what is the one thing I can do to move the needle today? So every single Monday, everyone decides, what is the one thing I can do this Monday that will move the needle? And I remember what was helpful. It was probably the first year, Fokan, our founder and CEO, would kind of listen, and he would help people, maybe say, no, that's probably not the most important thing. He would probably, recalibrate some people, point them in a different direction. And you only need to do that a few times before people start to learn, okay, actually, what is the most valuable thing I can do this week? And what you learn is that actually a lot of the stuff you do is just kind of fluff, bullshit, not important. It isn't the A+ priority. And I think that's helped us be very focused, but also operate quickly, because you spend, your prime hours in the week really kind of working on something that you win. Something else he kind of really highlighted was you actually don't have many weeks, right? So you have 52 weeks in a year, you take away 3 or 4 for vacation. There's a couple of weeks where you're sick and you're not like at 100%. Next thing you know, you're only up to 45, maybe 40 weeks, right? So it's actually not that many opportunities to really achieve and ship something great. And so you have to get them right. And so it's this kind of like mindset that you have that, oh shit, every week really matters. And I have to decide on Monday, because if you don't, you end up kind of drifting or going off in some bad directions. So that one really resonates.
Yeah, and there's real discipline in that. I like that point of having 2 elements. You have the company goal, and that probably has to be set at the top, right? What is our number one thing? In a marketing company, we're trying to do 2 things simultaneously. In the same way you're building products, we're trying to master our craft. So we need we need a series of goals, or a set of goals that work towards that. The other is the foundation of commercials, our ability to continue to invest in teams and grow. And I've actually observed this within our teams, the teams that all share a commercial responsibility, meaning there's a bit more transparency, and sales plays a bigger role in everybody's responsibility. They're the ones that are the most commercially successful. So it is very much that you move what you measure. And I do like that idea. And you raise a really important point, is we don't have as much time as we think. Startups are always in a race against the clock. Big companies too. And I actually say, you're making this you're describing this from a place of like, we have to be a high agency business. We have to wake up every day and drive the mission forward. So that matters for you. I actually would argue it matters more in larger organizations that are just filled with bureaucracy, where you could argue 70% of what is done isn't moving the needle, it's administrating, and it's justifying projects, and it's justifying your existence. And that's what most organizations become like. So I would argue actually that singular mission and that focus, and it's the reason that a company over 20 years can become they seem to have this just relentless discipline that is very top down, these kind of world changing companies. Number 9 on this list, I think, is an important one, and you will resonate with this as a startup. Move fast. At Facebook, it was normal to work 12 plus hours a day. We were constantly pushing out new features and letting our users give feedback. So it was all about doing things with urgency, moving fast, and allowing those feedback loops. as a startup, your biggest advantage against giant companies is speed. Is that just straight facts and a given? What would you add to that?
It's speed, but also the ability to take risks and dramatically change the direction of the company, right? Like, what people don't realize is that, once you have a big business that's generating a lot of revenue, the question really is, like, if you then, have this great idea or you see a product opportunity, why would the company go in that direction? You're making billions of revenue in this direction. It doesn't really make sense to move in that direction. And so to get this, you think about it as like a ship, right? If you have like a cruise ship, to get them to turn, right, from one direction to the other, is this big like movement. If you're a little dinghy, very, very easy to just kind of like whip yourself in the other direction because you don't have the burden of a huge amount of revenue already pointing you in this direction and momentum there. So you can very quickly, shift that direction. And I think the other kind of unspoken thing is that when you have a startup, you tend to have a higher concentration of people who are more bought into the mission, right? Yeah. Which means that they are able to execute at a level which is probably higher and more intense, and they're closer together. When you have a bigger company, you suddenly have kind of people who maybe aren't as bought in, they're not working at the pace or working at the intensity that you need to be able to ship a lot. So just naturally, you just don't have that pace. I don't know if it's more complicated than that.
Yeah, it's a given. Speed is an advantage, right? And you're right. Large, complex organizations have more risk whenever they make a decision. More people involved, so naturally you do things slower. My observations, having worked as a partner for lots of big global businesses, the ones that seem to be more inventive and entrepreneurial and actually have those rapid growth stories, they either have a culture of doing things fast and accepting that, you will experiment a lot and fail your way to the right answers, and or they create space to do things quickly. And what I mean by that is they have smaller teams. They can be just partitioned off that seem to have more permission to play. They have more permission to do things quickly. But I think fundamentally, it's one of the reasons why I think some of the founding principles of Amazon were really smart. One of the most complex, large organizations in the world in terms of people. It should have diseconomies of scale, and it certainly does. But they're still able to move at somewhat of a speed because they have some kind of folklore embedded within their culture, the pizza box rule. No team will be bigger than like 2 pizzas. So you keep teams smaller within much bigger organizations. The other things about day one mentality, which we're always trying to reinvent. We're pretending it's day one. So I think there are things that larger organizations can do. However, it usually starts from their origins. And then they have a management team or a set of founders that are just relentless in preserving and protecting those values and mission statements and just making sure they're ingrained in everybody. It kind of ladders a little bit to number 8 here. It says only hire A players. Mark would only hire people he would be happy to work for. Even our customer support team was filled with Harvard PhDs. Facebook employees have gone on to start and found Asana, Quora, AppSumo, OpenAI, and more. People are the game in any company. I'm going to go sideways. What's your definition of an A player? What characteristics do your A players share?
I think Mark pulls it out well, where it's somebody I would go into business with, like somebody I would, I would drop everything to run a company with. It's somehow.
It's a good line though. That who do you work for? That's a great line. That's a beautiful. Yeah.
Yeah, and it's somebody who you feel like they have something you don't. They have like knowledge that you don't. They have a skill. They have passion that you don't. And I think it tends also to be someone who sees the company as their own, regardless of their position. And that you see that all the way from senior people. You see that to people who junior interns who have just joined, they really feel like this is their company, and they know and they understand that their personal success is tied to the success of the company. Which I think a lot of people don't realize and they don't really think about. They sometimes think, I don't have a huge, I don't know, maybe my position on the cap table isn't that big, or I'm still early in my career, so it doesn't really matter. I've worked with people who are super young in their careers, their first roles, and I can tell that they know that if our company succeeds, then it's great for their career. And so they really, really feel and own it. They push it. And they're like, like texting their friends to try out this, or like, tweeting about the new landing page. Like they're just doing everything they can because they really believe in it. And so I think making it feel like it's their own, like having that ownership is another trait that I would look for.
And what is that? Because you're right in the sense that this guy, employee number 30, now runs a $100 million business, and he got fired after 60 days. Like, the point being, and I'm sure he probably did well if he had stock options, or done incredibly well if he was employee number 30. But what does that actually mean? You're describing like high agency. You're almost describing like care, aren't you? There are people that are just immensely passionate and just care. It doesn't matter what they're doing, they care. How would you distill that down if you're looking for an A player, which is like the $1 million question?
I think like high intellect is if you get really good to get like really granular into like what their traits are, right? It's like the high intellect, they understand things, they understand complicated ideas.
Yes.
But they also have energy is another thing I'd say. And you meet a lot of like highly intelligent, they go to good schools, go to good colleges, but they don't necessarily have that passion or energy that's driving them. And I think the final, I guess hunger is what it is, right? It's like, who really wants this? Who is really hungry for the success of their career, the success of their company? And I think hunger probably trumps everything. If somebody's really hungry, they'll usually go the extra mile, they'll usually do the work, which then elevates them to become that A player.
Yeah, I agree. I have a few that I've come to admire. One of them is always care. I talk about care, and care manifests in terms of passion for the craft, but cares also how they treat their employees, that no task is too small or too big, right? It's that mentality. The second one is resilience. I think people that are just highly resilient, so have people overcome adversity in some form. I think that just, you tend to find that A players are very resilient, high agency, they're autonomous. To your point, you could leave them a day and they would be inherently just really proactive and would just do stuff. And that probably stems from being really curious. I'll give you a good example. And, our CFO, I consider a real high agency person, and he's had a phenomenal career. But one of the things I still admire, we have a Web3 business. What does he go out and do? He buys loads of books on the blockchain and just decides that he wants to learn, just so he can truly understand the dynamics. And, not to say that, but he's very experienced, had nearly a 30-year career. And the fact that he still does that today is so damn admirable. And that's kind of like, the mentality you need of real elite players. And then the last one I will say, I heard a phrase from a business creator, and she described what she looks for in A players as a winning track record, but she rebranded it. It was called something else. But just this idea of people that have, whatever it is they've done, they've just got this thing where they just know how to win. Like, success follows them. They have more successes than failures. We always talk about, like, failures aren't really failures. Losses are lessons. You hear these phrases that sound good. The reality is you'll tend to find people that do well, have won quite a lot. They were pretty good at that one thing, or they figured it out because they're intelligent and, intuitive and all the qualities you need, etc., etc. But yeah, I think that track record of being able to win at something is really important, because it's also self-fulfilling in confidence. When you consistently win, it's the self-image, it's the story you tell yourself. And it's the conviction that you gain through achievements and that first party evidence, which is really interesting. Number 7 on this, which I thought was good, treat your employees well. Facebook did a lot of things that are the norm now. Free lunches, free dry cleaning, paid for our apartments. I don't think this is the norm. I think that's a very tech perspective, Noah. Buying apartments. But treat your employees well. It doesn't have to be about money. Interesting, because you kind of don't get that from Zuck, but he's right in terms of putting your people first in that people, product, profit in that order. And if you prioritize things in that order, you'll probably not go far wrong. How do you think about, I suppose, treating employees well? Is it just an obvious one?
Yeah, but I think it's evolved a lot since those days, right? Where back then it may have been free lunches, it may have been, travel, apartments, whatever that looks like. I think now where I'm seeing it is that the real shift is in flexibility and allowing work not to impose on people's personal lives and giving them immense autonomy. And this comes with finding great A players, right? Where I think we've always been very much of the belief that output trumps everything, right? And the flexibility of your work schedule should be a given now. We have people, some of the absolute highest performers in the company are also, looking after 2 toddlers while they work. And that means that sometimes they're appearing on calls. Sometimes they have to, take the morning off to take them to the doctor. And I don't think that's, 10, 15 years ago, that was necessarily the norm. And so I feel like we have turned this page where immense flexibility over your schedule. If I wanted to drop everything and go work from Mexico tomorrow for a week, I could, right? There is an understanding amongst the team that ability to kind of fit your work around your personal life is how it should be. But that doesn't mean that, it doesn't take away from high expectations and a high pressure environment. And I think that that's the trade-off that you make if you want to work with someone with that flexibility. You're probably also going to have to work a little bit harder, and startups are tough, right? They just are, and if you pick this hard, again, something Furkan always says, like, this is actually the hard option. Choosing Facebook to be the 30th employee is actually the hard option. It seems really easy now. You look back and go, oh, what an obvious choice. But actually, working at an internet startup, high chance of failure. You're probably turning down a much bigger salary elsewhere. You're betting on equity to make up for that. It is the hard option. You work harder. A lot of these big tech jobs, you can kind of chill. You work 3 days a week. No one's really checking in on you. It is the harder option. It is the harder route. And people have to understand that. And it's something that Furkan actually asks. I found it actually asks in every interview is like, are you cut out for this? Like, do you want this? Like, because trust me, this isn't going to be the easy route. And so it's a combination of treating them right, but also in return of that flexibility, you do have to give a bit more.
Man just almost called corporate culture lazy. He's been in startups for too long.
I mean, it is.
No, I agree with you. I think what you were describing, I don't think our wants and needs from an employer have ever changed. I assume levels of autonomy and fulfillment and freedom to choose, I don't think that's changed. I think maybe what has changed is people's I suppose expectations of what an employer does for them. And I also think companies like Facebook, and I reflect on Social Chain early days where you're having unlimited holidays, and I know some people are cynical of that whole thing. But I do think that laid the foundation for people to question the 9-to-5 norms. But then COVID had people questioning again in a really material way. And the overall lesson that I tend to take away is just making sure that you're as compassionate and people-focused as you can be within the confines of what a company can afford. We were talking in our internal management team and competing for talent, for new talent coming in. We're not going to compete with technology companies that don't have to make money to pay everyone, right? technology companies sometimes have, if you're a really well-funded AI startup, you have many advantages over someone that has to be a lot more intentional with all their actions and how they're deploying their time. So, I think it's subjective. And fundamentally, it's more than just like the shiny things that you buy for people or the like perks that become normalized and standardized. Next one, I thought this was interesting. Number 6, it says, scratch your own itch. I use Facebook to connect with friends and meet girls, which meant if I saw something wrong, I could fix it myself. Most people start businesses in categories they don't have an interest in. Build selfishly, share selfishly. And I thought, I read that the first time and I go, I would argue that too many people work and build and join companies they don't care about at all. And I know one of your main motivations in kind of being and being part of the founding team of Third Web was you were just really interested in Web3 at the time. Having spent a career in social media, you were the next reiteration of the internet was something, and that was your entire focus. I remember us having quite a few conversations when you were looking at different opportunities that this was the one. So I think you're probably more guided by something like this than most people, right?
Yeah, and I think it's more important in a company like ours than most, where I think in the early days, we were actually a little less, we put less emphasis on this, where we kind of said, if somebody has a background elsewhere or they're not really interested in Web3, it doesn't really matter because we're looking for the best talent. I'd say that's shifted because over the last 2 years, there's a direct correlation between the people who really care about this industry and care about the work and care about Third Web and want it to succeed. So going back to what we were saying, that one of the ways you look for those people who are deeply passionate about the mission of the company, they also tend to be deeply passionate about the industry. They really care about it. And this is their opportunity to make a mark on that industry. And I actually don't think it really works if you come into a company, you don't care at all about the industry you're in. I don't know if you can really give 110% and make a long-lasting impact. I think you burn out. I think after a year or two, you sit there and you question, why am I even here? I don't really understand the mission that I'm pushing here. So I actually would go a step further and say that it's critical that you're in an industry that you're deeply passionate about and you really want to move the needle on, because that's how I think you make impactful work over a long period of time.
Yeah, and I'd like to say organizations should look inwards on that. So that's a really good foundation, having a group of people that care about your industry. It seems like a prerequisite, but it's not as common as probably most people would like to think. Yeah. I think there's another dynamic where, and it stems from a few conversations I've had with team members, organizations need to create space for people to master their craft and do that as a solo performer, not just in a group setting. So what you tend to be in an organization is a victim of your own success. Given you could be an exceptional creator or video editor or a specialist in any given endeavor, and your natural progression is to then go manage people. And just because you can doesn't mean you should. And actually, the minute that then you do that, you're not only leaning less into where your real value creation is, and you could argue that just passing on your knowledge and your skills is probably one of the best exercises and the best ROIs. But generally speaking, you're going to be less fulfilled unless you're doing the thing that you're deeply passionate about. So I think when we talk about kind of doing that scratch your own itch, I think it means in two forms. I think it means being the industry that you actually care about and have an invested interest in, but also find space to do the thing that you love. If you're inherently a creative and you're not creating anymore and you're just managing, that's a path where things become transactional and you will burn out. So I think there's those two dynamics in that sense, but I totally agree with you. Number 5, pay attention to the details. It says here, pay attention to the details. I remember Mark sent me an email at 3 a.m. telling me that I missed a period in one of the documents. A period. Mark set high standards and excellence for all of us. It was challenging, but super rewarding. Sweat the small stuff. I think it's a given. I don't think enough people do. I think it's maybe a reflection and embodiment of all that kind of, care, passion. If you care about something, we always used to say this around work. I would hate when work would come to me and you'd ask the person, what do you think of it? Like, and a proposal, a piece of work, some client work, and they go, yeah, it's all right. I'm like, well, why are you not, like, you're putting your name to this. How can you send me something that you don't get? That for me is like the biggest sin you can do. If you don't like it, how's anyone else going to like it, right?
Yep. Yeah.
Pay attention to the details. What would you add to that?
I completely agree. I think when I spend a lot of time signing off creative work, and the worst thing is when it gets to me and there's things that I know that they know are wrong.
Yeah.
And have been missed. And they're almost waiting for me to go back to them. And I just think, like, I wouldn't, you need to operate in a way that you're only as good as your worst piece of work. You're only as good as the worst piece of content you put out. So every single piece needs to be excellent. And so I completely agree. It's this delicate balance between, obviously, you're in a fast-paced environment. You want to put out, you want to ship a lot, you want to put a lot of content out there. But I don't mind spending 2 or 3 hours on revisions. I joke with my team. Sometimes we have a video and it'll come back like version 16, version 17.
Yeah.
And I'll say, no, well, that's what we have to do to get there, because it has to be excellent. Otherwise, we're not going to get the edges over other teams, because we're competing for edges.
Yeah. The being crippled by perfectionism, it can also work against you. And you see a lot of organizations and individuals are that. But I do think there's a healthy balance to strike between real attention to detail and actually creating a culture where you can have honest communication around why something is done in a certain way. Often I make many compromises because I'm viewing an opportunity cost. We will produce something. I know it could be better, but I think the trade-off is X, Y, and Z, and you make a decision. But it's a conscious decision. It's not that, so it's like you have to have both, and you have to have, I suppose, both of those dynamics. And I think if you create that healthy culture of communicating, this isn't our best work, or we would have done this slightly differently, but we're not going to correct it for these reasons. I think that's how you ultimately serve those two paradoxes in some senses, perfection versus, getting stuff done. Number 4 that he had written, give ownership to the team. Surprisingly, Mark wasn't super involved in the day-to-day operations. He coded some of the time, but was mostly focused on macro vision. He was great about giving people a goal, some boundaries, and coaching them from the sidelines. How do you feel about ownership, democratizing an organization? It's almost a given, right?
Yeah, I think, it's trust as well, right? It's like, if you have great people, they should feel like they can own and have autonomy over, what would be high value outputs or asks. And another thing we think about a lot is, like, sometimes you have to let people fail as well. Very, very tempting as a manager to come in and see something not going well or not being done properly, and I'll just do it myself. And we have this thing called the hero complex, right? Where the worst thing a manager can do is come in and go, oh, my team, they can't get anything right, and I had to do all the work for them, and I'm dragging this team on my back, and I'm the only one who can competently do anything. And actually, no, that's your problem. Your problem is that you haven't trusted your team, or you haven't trained them and given them feedback to get to that right answer yourself.
Yes.
And that's the one thing you want to avoid, is when that's how you get these really negative bottlenecks. So when you have one person who feels like, I'm the only person in this company who could do anything properly. Well, you're probably not. You're probably just not allowing, or you're not giving feedback in an effective way. And you're not allowing somebody else to fail and take the learnings that you probably took 5-10 years ago. And so, no, we're big believers in everybody should be an owner, and everybody should have autonomy. And, if you're in this company, you're here for a reason. You're smart, you're bright, you meet the bar, and they should be expected to do so, rather than, immediately assume that it's not the right thing.
I think reframing is really important whenever you have a managerial or leadership position in an organization. Everything is your fault. If someone makes a mistake, it's you haven't trained them, you've given them a task that they're either not ready for or doing the wrong thing. You've hired someone that's not ready, and in all of those cases, you are to blame. Fundamentally, you are to blame. And I think if you reframe that, You operate as an organization in a really healthy way where you you naturally do the things to upskill everyone. And what do they say? Tides rise. So I think that's a really good one. Number 3, people, not users. Mark would yell at us if we said users. They're human beings, he'd tell us. On the other side of a username or email address is a fellow human. I absolutely love this. Marketing is full of jargon. If I hear the word Gen Z, Alpha, I always say young people. I say young people. If we describe anyone as anything that is just marketing vernacular, I hate it. You're talking about people. I've always said this because I think language matters. It's self-fulfilling. And when you when you use language that disconnects you from what it is or who it is you're speaking to, that's why I hate B2B marketing, like traditional B2B marketing, because it's built on acronyms. And it's you are always selling to a person. And the minute that you use language that reaffirms that you're not, I think you make bad decisions. And it's the most cardinal basic sin that so many people make.
Yeah, and I think it ends up trickling down to the way that you execute as well. You become obsessed with data. You become obsessed with, everything but the psychology behind the marketing. Like really understanding, would I as a person consume this? Would I click this? Would I care about this? Right? Rather than, I've A/B tested this and I know that this tactic works. You're forgetting that there's actually a human sat on the other end, and how do they operate and why do they operate?
Yeah, I love it. Number 2, hire fast, fire faster. My boss was fired the day I started. My next boss was fired a month later. I got fired in 9 months. Mark was intense about keeping A players only. That's really interesting. How do you feel about the hire fast, fire fast?
I don't think I agree with hire fast, actually. I think hire slow, fire fast is a better way of doing it. I don't think it's a good idea to have... I think it's disruptive internally for company culture if there are people being brought on constantly and then disappearing a week later because they weren't the right fit. I think that comes across as messy and generally disruptive. But firing fast makes a lot of sense. I agree with that. And I think you have to be very, very... the standards have to be incredibly high, and you have to understand... You usually have a hunch, you usually have a gut reaction, and I've learned 9 times out of 10, when I ignore that gut reaction, it comes back to bite me 6 months later, and you've wasted time on somebody who wasn't right, and they probably didn't want to be there either. But hiring slow, I think, is also important, because you need to have a very strong, stringent process to identify the right people. And I think I've seen when you rush that hiring, that tends to be where you waste a lot of time and energy on people who aren't right for the organization. So that's probably the one I disagree with, and something that I think we as a company don't align with.
Yeah, I think it's a great reframing. The hire slow, you need to be robust. And I think that robust hiring process is in part figuring out, A, being very clear on what you're hiring for. You hire for strengths. B, ensuring you try and remove as much bias out of the process and a clear measurement framework. And then C, I think once you have hired, you need to set people up for success by setting expectations and being really clear and having great onboarding processes and giving people the tools to be successful. And if all of those factors are true and you aren't the right place, environment, team, mission for any given person, then you probably should fire fast. And most organizations struggle with that because they'll have HR departments that are disconnected from the operators. It feels very it feels like a real lack of compassion when you fire someone. It's very difficult to have difficult conversations, but a big part of me has come to learn that it's actually a compassionate thing to do, in the sense that you don't want to see people in environments where they're going to be unable to succeed. It's not good for you, and it's certainly not good for them, their morale, their confidence. And I'm rarely to see, and this may sound controversial, if I'm being honest, the most talented, best people I've worked with, within a month, I've never had, or very infrequently ever had, anyone that wasn't like exceptional in the first month. in some way or another. Doesn't mean they were perfect at the job or did everything right, but within the first month, you kind of know. So, and I think it's really important that organizations respect that. So completely agree with the hire slow, fire fast methodology.
I think in the first week.
First week, probably doing in Web3 land, things move fast. Yeah, you know what? You're probably not far wrong. Last one. And I should give Noah credit for this. He's called Noah Kagan because it's actually a really cool thread. The last one, he said, have a big-ass vision. We were all in our 20s when Mark was offered $1 billion to sell Facebook. When he said no, he sent a message to all of us around the world. His goal was to connect the entire world. That inspired the shit out of us. What do you think about having those big missions? You've got a pretty big one.
Yeah, I think it's very easy to get dragged down in the day-to-day, your task list, right? Like, the interesting thing about startups is that a lot of the work's actually quite boring. It's like, interpreted as this crazy, fast, exciting, you're hacking and, billion users. Actually, most of the time, it's kind of steady compounding growth. It's doing mechanical tasks over again. It's recruiting and hiring. It's scrolling on LinkedIn for hours looking for the right candidates. It's actually boring, right? And I think that's a big difference people have to make is people say, I love my job, I love my work. Well, I don't actually love scrolling on LinkedIn, right? What I do love is the mission that I'm contributing to, right? I think that's the big difference is when you have this North Star, when you believe you're building towards something far greater than yourself and that feels big, that's when you really love what you're doing. You learn to love the details and the small pieces. And it feels like you've kind of, built this castle brick by brick. And so that's why I think it's so important to have this wider mission because otherwise I don't know how we'd get through the mundane parts of, business, which is the reality of it.
Yeah, it's a huge enabler and motivator when you think of your chances of failure are high. You're taking on a very difficult task. I always think creating value out of nothing is so audacious when an entire industry that has every advantage, every resource over you should be able to win. You kind of have to do things that others aren't or aren't willing to do in order to achieve that success. The one thing I would add around having a big-ass vision, I think that's a given, but I don't necessarily know every organization or company can. But what I do think is worthy is to at least have an adversary. What are you fighting against? It's not always what are you fighting for. What are you fighting against? And, you'll see this from very certain purpose-led organizations. It's not that, like, their mission might be to sell more clothes, but they're usually, like, fighting against something. The unethical practices in fashion. Like, you name it, you pick it. I think it's really good to have an enemy. Or like when we started our sort of social media careers, we were the kids that made things trend, internet kids. We were fighting against like old ad land that did TV ads and like did things in a very certain way. And I think it's nice to have a adversary. And I think that can be equally as motivating as like, we're going to change the world mission. I think super important. Dude, as always, great speaking to you. It's nearly midnight in Malta now, so I am absolutely peppered. But yeah, I'll chat to you next week.
See you next week.